Greetings from the county line. If you can see us this afternoon, we're not there. We've decided that we're going to take it to the streets for the next month or so and introduce you to some major dudes, I'll call them. And I got that term from a Steely Dan song that was written in 1973. Donald Fagen put it together. Nobody thought much of it at the time. I guess it was part of their Pretzel Logic album, and it was on the B side of Ricky Don't Lose That Number. But over time, it's gained a lot of significance. The lyrics are pretty simple, but basically it sounds like somebody trying to tell a friend from a philosopher's point of view that it's going to be okay. The world may be screwed up today, but the human spirit will save us. So in that light, I've reached out. I've actually left county line. Not that there's not some pretty major dudes out that way, but I knew I could find some in Kokomo. So we're here at Maylig Park with Michael Holsapple, who is a major dude. Now, I'll tell you what that means to me. A major dude is somebody who has tried to find enlightenment their entire life. They've never shut their mind to anything. They've learned from experience and from reading and studying and watching other people and making mistakes and suffering the consequences from them. Before we get started, I think I need to tell you something about him, a few things that I know about him. Michael was a very gifted student in high school, and an Air Force brat. His father was a career Air Force pilot, a bomber pilot, who was shot down over a bombing mission in Vietnam, evaded the enemy, but for several days the family thought he was missing in action. He was rescued, and in the tradition of the American fighting man, returned to his unit, where they gave him a fresh airplane and sent him back up into the sky again. But Colonel Holsapple thought that his son, Michael, was so gifted that he would do well in the State Department. So I'm sure they had to scrape some money together. Michael went out to Johns Hopkins, earned an undergraduate, graduate degree, was in the doctoral program when he transferred to Indiana University Law School. And it was there in the summer of 1978 that he had an opportunity to join Howard County Prosecutor Fred Osborne as an intern. And it was also during that summer that a young woman named Mandy Llewellyn disappeared. Her body was found a few days later in a woods by Northwestern schools. She'd been raped and murdered. And Prosecutor Osborne asked Michael to act as a liaison between the police and his prosecutor staff during the course of the investigation. Michael accepted that challenge, and it was an opportunity that quite literally changed his life to the benefit of our community. Because the following year he applied to the Kokomo Police Department, had a brilliant career, starting of course at the bottom, as everybody does, as a patrol officer, detective, undercover narcotics agent. He worked his way up through administration, was one of the first administrative officers to work on the accreditation of the Kokomo Police Department, and then was promoted to inspector in charge of the operations division, which is the third highest ranking officer in the police department. Michael finished his police career as a commander of a multi-jurisdictional drug task force, commanding not only city, but county, state, and federal officers. Also, while he was working, he went back to school, earned a master's degree in criminal justice from Indiana State University, and graduated from the very prestigious FBI National Academy at Quantico. So here we've got a balance of a guy who not only has a lot of book learning, he's clearly an academic, but he's also seen the real world from ground level. When he retired from the police department, he accepted a teaching position at Indiana University, taught there briefly, went to Ivy Tech, and rose to become chairman of their criminal justice department. He retired last year, semi-retired. He's still teaching domestic violence classes, I think. And I just asked him to sit down with us here in Maylig Park on the west side of Kokomo to give us some perspective on some issues that I think you'll find interesting. So hi.
Well, hello, Tom. Thank you for what a generous introduction.
Well, I forgot to mention that you were one of the original authors of the Port Huron papers and shared an apartment with Frank Serpico in Greenwich Village back in 1967.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that, and I was at Woodstock. And so there's a few omissions, but I forgive you for
I can't
those.
Cover everything.
No, you can't. It would take up most of our day, and we've already endured a passing storm, so we don't risk much more time doing that. Thank you. You were very generous in your introduction.
I gotta ask you, man, it seemed like you were on a fabulous trajectory. You weren't going to be stopped. You were a rising star, working on your law degree, had already graduated from a very prestigious university. What in the hell would make you apply to the Kokomo Police Department?
Meeting some very impressive people that both you and I had the great pleasure and honor to work with. Legendary people like Lynn Rudolph and Charlie Hackett and Jim Bohannon and John Urlock and Mike Cody and George Weir and names that Don Mills and
what impressed you about these people?
They convinced me very early on in my exposure, quite frankly, that I like them more than I like lawyers. and some people might think that that's not a very hard push, but frankly, I mean that very sincerely, because you made reference to this investigation. In fact, there were 3 critical investigations occurring simultaneously. There was another murder that was being investigated, and there was also an alleged abduction of a physician's wife that was occurring at the same time. And what I was able to witness during my participation principally with the investigative team was men who were so dedicated to their purpose that they literally worked themselves to exhaustion and would sleep on the floor. They would just sort of pull up I remember John Hurlock particularly fondly grabbing a Coke bottle one time and using that as a pillow so he could catch a nap. There was no sense that anyone would go home, that anybody would take a break. There was too much urgency to serving the public interest and resolving the investigative inquiry and bringing closure to these 3 particular criminal incidents at the time. But that was characteristic. Though that sounds like, well, that sounds pretty remarkable, but quite frankly, it was pretty normal. And you know that because you and I both came along in relatively a similar time frame. And we were part of a local city, Kokomo City Police Department, in what I would characterize as the golden years, attributable to numerous people, but I think principally to Lynn Rudolph. I think he was a visionary police chief, and he constructed a willingness to believe that we really could make a difference and that we could contribute to this community, and not only as law enforcement officers, but genuinely as part of our community, as members of a community that cared about each other and cared about the different functions that occurred within our city.
You weren't from here. You didn't know anything about this town.
No, I was the first time I came to this community. I was a law student and just happened, as you mentioned, was able to to be placed as an intern in the prosecutor's office, and decided I got weary of traveling, what now seems a relatively short distance between here and Indianapolis, but at the time was somewhat tedious to me. So I moved into Kokomo and was sort of, again, enchanted by the people I met and the treatment that I was afforded and the welcome that I was given. And I felt truly a part of history. And I mean that very, very humbly, because I was just a part of many what I consider historical figures of that time, of that age.
If you'll stick around for a few more episodes, I want to talk to you about some of your really, I'd call them famous investigations. But before we do that, while we're talking about cops and the fact that you left what was probably going to be a pretty great career to become a law enforcement officer, there seems to be a crisis in police recruiting right now.
Well, no doubt there is
What is going on? Why can't we find people who want to do that job?
I think there's a number of factors, at least that I can identify. Preeminent among those are the fact that we had a societal backlash toward policing with the George Floyd incident and the recognition that bad police actually existed and police were willing to acknowledge that and hold them responsible. But that wasn't enough for a significant portion of society, and they wanted to push back on that, and we had cries from sectors within our culture, as you well know, as everyone knows, to defund the police and destabilize policing and rip it apart and tear it down, and we didn't need it, and nonsensible and nonsensical types of thought expressed at the time. And I think that contributed to police having this sense that in a very formidable way, they weren't appreciated for the risk that they endure daily, because there is a certain reality that police officers know, and I don't want to overstate it, because most police officers, as you and I both know, go through their entire career without even pulling their weapon out of their holster. But the reality is, you don't know that from moment to moment and from day to day. And your family doesn't know that from moment to moment and day to day. And so every time you walk out the door, it is literally true. It may be the last time that you do that and that your family sees you. And so police felt underappreciated, unrecognized for the sacrifices that they make. And so it sort of deterred an interest in policing. I was in academia when this was happening, and I witnessed this firsthand. I had students who were in a criminal justice program who literally would come to me and as a faculty advisor and ask me to assist them in transferring their chosen major to business or some alternative career interest, because they just didn't want to be police anymore. In addition, they began to recognize, because there was a great deal of reality occurring in the recent years, to assassinations of police that were going on, where police officers were eating lunch in a patrol car and people would walk up and assassinate them.
It's clearly a more physically dangerous job today than it was
when
we did it.
No question.
I gotta throw this in while I have an opportunity, because Cliff Stover made this point to us when we were rookie officers. As dangerous as law enforcement is physically, it's much more dangerous emotionally.
Oh yeah, and
no one talks about that. No one talks about the post-traumatic stress disorder, which wasn't even it wasn't even a concept when we were young officers, but it's a real thing, and it builds up and builds up and builds up until, my God, Michael, nearly everybody we worked with wound up at least divorced. if not with some sort of substance abuse problem by the time they got out of that job.
Well, not only that, but we could count, and I don't want to count because I really don't want to remember them in that context.
Of course not.
But how many did we lose through suicide? As almost a counterpoint to what we're witnessing with our military personnel returning from combat exposure in service to our nation. I've often suggested, as an educator, that policing is a domestic war, and it's often overlooked, precisely as you're suggesting, that the risk emotionally, the risk morally, the moral challenges, the moral dynamics are so misconstrued, or so misunderstood, and very seldom taught, very seldom instructed formally. Now some educators have studied it, and some theorists have brought some exposure to that, but it really hasn't found its way operationally to any significant degree, sadly, because as you describe or allude to, policing has one of the highest rates of divorce, has the highest rates of substance abuse, highest rates of suicide. I mean, occupationally, they are a very suffering group of men and women in our culture.
What is so emotionally dangerous about that job?
Well, I think it's, again, I think you're exposed to principally being called to resolve the unresolvable. Over and over and over again, you're asked to fix the unfixable, if I can sort of repeat myself and use terms that maybe aren't as proper as an academic might employ, but I think convey the notion that you're called to family fights, you're called to substance abuse crisis, you're called to an array of social issues that you're just ill-trained, you're ill-prepared, you're not formally educated, many of us, to address, nor do you have the time, because increasingly, even during our time, but it's certainly worsened, calls get stacked up. Your people are, while you're trying to resolve something, someone else is tapping on your shoulder, so to speak, in terms of your radio going off, asking you to move on to the next hurdle and the next crisis, the next problem. And so you very seldom...
The best example of that is something somebody told me when I was a young officer about responding to an overdose case where a woman had overdosed with drugs, and the people that she was with thought she was going to die, didn't want her to die in their apartment, so they just carried her out in the yard and left her there. And when the cops got there, they were able to get her breathing again, get her going. They get the information they need, they get back on the radio and tell the dispatcher that they're available, and the next call they get is to get a cat out of a tree. And this officer's like, don't you realize I just saved someone's life?
No,
and you don't care. I mean, somebody's got a cat in the tree I got to go get now.
Or a bat in someone's kitchen.
Exactly.
and that's exactly it. I think that the juxtaposition of crisis to almost inane response problems compounds one's ability to make sense of it all. And that's cumulative, which is the nature of post-traumatic stress. And in addition, quite frankly, I think most police officers endure an individual crisis. Almost every officer has a moment where they've had a child die in their arms. They've responded to a horrific scene that is unforgettable. They cannot unremember what this impact was, and it haunts you. And again, there's no formal. My father, as you mentioned, was a career military guy, and he used to critically. He loved me and supported me, and And he supported police, but he was critical in always saying, you know, Michael, police are not as disciplined as the military. And because we follow protocols and we follow disciplined regulations, and you don't. And what really stood out to me in my conversations with him after I had a few years of experience is what he used to refer to as debriefings. Our debriefings were over alcohol. our debriefings were over some kind of excess behavior that did no one any good. As you said, led to extremes that results in divorce or self-loathing or self-destruction in some fashion. And destruction of those around you that matter to you. And then those things begin to haunt you and stay with you through the course of your lifetime. So those things, as more people began to see and witness more closely the reality of policing, I think individuals recognize who wants to do that.
Okay.
And then one further thing, the simple reality that there was a perception, why do I want to do a job where I might lose my job for doing it? And there was that perception as well, that you're under constant scrutiny. That has become ever more prevalent than our day, quite frankly, because now we're in the time of not only body cameras that officers are required to constantly maintain, and if good Lord, something happens and one of those malfunctions or is turned off for some reason, there's immediate recriminations that is some kind of conspiracy from out of somewhere. And then you have, everybody has a cell phone. And so you're not only responding to all these horrific situations or incredibly inane situations, you have people with cameras in front of your face saying and acknowledging to you, I'm watching you, I'm filming you, I'm reporting on you. I've often thought that policing, I don't mean to carry this on beyond what your interest may be or that of your audience, but I think
there's no audience.
Police. No, there's an audience. I know that you've enjoyed popularity. Police are really the visible representation of our democratic society. I really believe that. They're the most visible representation, for good and for ill. And when we're good, we're very good. And when we're not, we're very not. And that has become just more blatantly obvious.
What can communities do to make law enforcement more attractive to young people?
Well, I think unfortunately we've approached it with more of a capitalistic notion that we compete on the basis, and the market drives this. We compete on the basis of, and I hear this frequently from contemporary policing and police officers that we still know that are in the business, and those are few and fewer these days because I'm aging out of the business. But different communities are offering, I'll pay you more, I'll give you this incentive, I'll give you a car, I'll give you more vacation, I'll give you more leave, I'll give you more educational incentive, I'll pay for your uniforms. I mean, there's just one is trying to outdo the other constantly. And we're witnessing, I see from somewhat of a distance, what we enjoyed as a genuine camaraderie. And I don't mean to paint this as though everybody loved one another, because that certainly was not the truth. There were police officers among us that did not like each other.
Sure.
But they always supported each other. They were always there for each other. And they always had a sense of community among themselves. My sense is that doesn't exist today. That we bring in people that compete for, I may be here for a few years, but I'm looking for something else. And whoever, we're more like, have gun will travel. We're more like the old Western series, for those of us old enough to remember, that I'm looking for the next highest bidder. And it has a dramatic impact on the police culture and the service to the community.
Yeah, the culture's done, and it was inevitable though, because I think because you had to hold individual officers accountable, and it became a dog-eat-dog world, frankly, I think. But only because the administration's allowed it to happen.
Well, as you know, because of our friendship, I'm very much a critic of recent police administrations in our community as having lost their way and failed to maintain some sense of vision and purpose on the part of the police, and they abandoned the individual officers on the street and working their jobs, and we're paying a price for that. And quite frankly, I'm not afraid to name names. One of our mayors, Greg Goodnight, literally divested funding from the police department to put elsewhere to develop his vision of the community, and just literally stripped the number of officers available to our community. So we went from having some 20-some investigators to 5. And when you have the kind of description I provided earlier, when you have 20-some investigators working various investigations, all of whom are willing to sleep on a Coke bottle to catch a nap, to suddenly having 5 that are worn out when they begin,
well,
you've diminished the capacity to serve your community.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in my view, law enforcement is not particularly politically attractive. I mean, nobody needs the police unless somebody's shaking their door handle at 2 o'clock in the morning, just like nobody needs the fire department unless the kitchen's on fire. So Greg Goodnight recognized that, but he knew that in order to do the things that you just accused him of doing, which are absolutely true, he would have to do something about the culture of leadership within the Kokomo Police Department. So he engaged in what I think was a systemic program to take all the leadership, to just get rid of it, so that he could be in charge. He could call the shots. Nobody'd give him any static when he wanted to cut the detectives.
Oh, I agree with you. There was no resistance to try to maintain any degree of vision on behalf of the department, or to protect the individual members of the department.
And this isn't something that was unique to the KPD, because a lot of times I'll watch the news and I'll see these very same symptoms in a lot of other communities where it's apparent that politics is, and it's unfortunate, because during the period of time, the era that you and I had the opportunity to serve this community, there was clearly a thrust to eliminate politics in policing, because the two they can't go hand in hand. One ruins the other. You can't work for one and the other at the same time.
But in my judgment, the history of policing has phenomenally failed, not just in terms of their own efforts, but in terms of societal support, has failed at that. When we teach the history of policing, we segregate them into historical periods, and one of those periods is literally classified as the political era. That's such a misnomer, because politics has always been imbued in policing throughout the history of American policing, and to some extent, someone's nephew gets hired, someone's son gets preference, or daughter gets preferential treatment. And so politics always finds a way to infect it, to the degree that that infection is spreads and is more contagious.
And has influence.
And has influence. The greater, yes, exactly. The greater the detriment to the community and to the service of the profession itself. The profession. I find that an awkward term for policing as well, quite frankly. But there's a theorist. I think one of the greatest theorists of American policing is a guy by the name of Egon Bittner. And he's not a ghostbuster, so that's a real guy. That's a real author. And he has such a profound understanding, because I don't think he's ever served as a police officer himself, but he understood quite clearly that policing in a democratic society is automatically anathema to freedom, because we give a monopoly of authority and really a right to execute individuals. We give a monopoly to police of that kind of authority. And no one in a free society is happy about that. No one, ever. And so no one's ever going to like police. There's always going to be
the nature of the business.
A lack of genuine embracing of the police function and the police people. I think it's why we give each other nicknames like Bobby and Billy, and we try to endear ourselves to each other, because we really know nobody else likes us. So we might as well do our best to like each other.
Right. Anything you'd like to add before we wrap up this segment today?
Well, no, I don't know that I've contributed much of anything, but other than my enjoyment in talking to you, of course, and being honored to sit here with you, and especially being honored to sit here with you on a bench.
If you'll stick around for a while, I promise we'll move on beyond something other than the blue and gray.
Sure, I'm more than willing.
That's it for this week, folks. I hope you'll join us. Michael's going to come back for the rest of the month as a major dude. So God bless you. Have a good week.